last month, if you were here last month, you remember the three things we talked about. If you were not here last month, here they come. Conviction, conversion, calling. If you've been convicted, then likely you've been converted. And if you've been converted, you've been called. Some of us have been called to full-time vocational ministry. Some of you are bivocational. Some of us are twice retired and still going. Some of you are lay leaders in your church, you deacons, Sunday school teachers, whatever. Called. The passage we used last month, just to review, from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That's our goal. Whatever you've been called to, that's the goal. Whatever position God has put you in, as the options are listed there in Ephesians. The goal is always the same for all of us, and that is to achieve the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So tonight we start out talking about the minister's resume, not the one that you send to another church, but God's resume for you. It comes from Matthew chapter 5. That begins with what we normally call the Beatitudes. It's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, at least Matthew's version of it. Luke has similar version, Luke chapter 6 and following. Those Beatitudes are better called attributes. And they're the basic level of the Christian life, and certainly the basic level of God's calling. You say, why are we dealing with basics? Because you always go to the basics in ministry. You know what's going on in Florida and Arizona right now? Spring training. You know what those $1 million baseball players are doing right now? They're practicing, running around the bases, throwing it from the outfield to the infield, hitting the ball, bunting, basics. And the teams that do the best in spring training with basics are usually the teams that end up in the playoffs in September and October, because they get the basics there. So similar in ministry. Again, whether you're the pastor of the church or one of the lay leaders of the church or whatever your position is, we always go to the basics. So tonight, here are the basics, this resume. Attributes. What's an attribute? An attribute is an inherent characteristic. It's something you didn't have a choice in. You didn't ask for, you didn't develop, you inherited it. My mother was a perfectionist. Everything had to be perfect. My father was a workaholic. You put those two together, you get me. A perfection workaholic. That's a dangerous mix. I didn't ask for that. That's just what I inherited. My DNA got me being someone that just doesn't quit. And if you don't get it right the first time, you're going to do it over till you get it right. That's just basic. That's who I am. I didn't have a choice on that. We inherit certain characteristics. So here is Jesus. He's got his 12 men together now. And he's saying to them, this is who you are. These are not goals for you to accomplish. These are not things for you to learn. These are inherent. When you became a disciple, you inherited these things. This is who you are. So they are, well, let's get some background here. He goes to the mountain, and we don't know which mountain that was. There were a lot of mountains around the Sea of Galilee, and the Bible doesn't tell us which specific mountain. He just goes to a mountain. I said that in a church conference in one place, and the lady came up to me at the break time with her commentary, and there was a picture in it of a mountain, and she said, you said you didn't know where it was. I know. It's in this book. It says right here, Mount of Beatitudes. I said, well, okay, that's your mountain. So we don't know. I mean, you could pick a mountain anywhere around the Sea of Galilee and say, aha, Mount of Beatitudes. What we do know is likely Jesus was on the side of a mountain because the great acoustics would have been there. You could have spoken from the side of a mountain toward the Sea of Galilee, and people all the way down the mountainside would have been able to hear you. That makes sense, and so that's about all we can come up with. So he's on the mountain, and the scripture says, when he was seated, his disciples came to him. You know, one of the great things about the Bible is you don't ever run out of sermons. I did have a former student tell me one time that he had just preached everything he could find in the Bible. I said, well, you need to read some more. Because you don't have to read far to get a sermon. Like, when he was seated. You say, what's in that? Oh, a world of information. When you're seated in those days, that meant official teaching. Not casual teaching. Jesus did a lot of casual teaching. He's walking along the road. Gust of wind comes. A house falls over. He said, you guys see that? When you build a house on sand and the wind blows, it falls. You got to build your houses on solid rocks. Good teaching. They probably remembered it because it was a visual. But that wasn't official teaching. The official teaching was always done sitting down. In fact, in the days before that, and in those days, when the professor, the teacher walked into the room, all the students stood up. The teacher would walk in, sit down at the desk, and all the students would sit back down. And now that he is seated, we have official teaching. So the Beatitudes, the attributes, these first verses in Matthew 5, these are official. And he's saying to them, this is who you are. Let's back up just a bit to get Luke's version of this. And Luke says that he went to the mountain to pray, and he continued all night in prayer. Now, the next thing that happens in Luke's version of this is he finishes out that group of 12 disciples. Remember, he called 4 to start with, and now he needs 8 more. So he finishes calling those 8. Now he's got 12. Then comes the Beatitudes, the attributes. How important is it for Jesus to spend all night praying? When was the last time you spent all night praying about anything? I don't mean waking up in the middle of the night and praying. I mean you started out praying, and your intention was to pray all night long. I don't suppose we do that very often. I don't think I do it very often. I often wake up in the night praying, go back to sleep praying, but I don't intend to pray all night long. I do value the importance of prayer. This is a picture of my office at Southwestern Seminary. I'll back away from the mic just a minute to show you some things. This is a prayer bench. It's a single prayer bench. They're hard to find. You got to shop antique stores and junk places and to find a one-person prayer bench. But that's in my office because I don't want to ever did not when I was teaching full-time, did not ever want to go to class without stopping at that bench to kneel and to pray. And I'd have on that bench, on the tray, a seating chart so I could pray for my students by name before I go to class to try to teach them. So to help my prayer life, I would have several things around this bench. And when I had a larger office, and when you got moved at seminary, when you were on the faculty and you got moved to a newer building, but all the newer buildings had smaller offices. I don't know which architect figured that out. But you go to a newer building, smaller office, got to get rid of books, got to get rid of some stuff. You know those cards that prompt you to pray that missionaries have? Prayer cards, got their picture on it. Maybe it tells you where they are, where they serve. And I had those all on bulletin boards, on peg boards, you know. I had to take all those off. So here those are in a book. I can just turn the page and I've got 6 more missionaries to pray for. It's just a bookshelf full of things. I determined when I was traveling so much that to help me remember to pray for a country, take something back from that country that would prompt me to pray. And for lack of a more intelligent term, I just call that prayer prompts. You need prayer prompts, things that just remind you to pray for places or people or things. So these are prayer prompts. You see that? That's a concrete shingle. It's off Lottie Moon's school. I was in northern China. We were at the place where Lottie Moon had her girls' school. And over against the fence were all these concrete shingles. I said, what are those? And the guy said, well, her school blew over and they just destroyed it, and those are the shingles. And I said, what are they doing there? He said, well, they just threw them over there. I said, can I have one? He said, you can have all of them. Well, I don't want all of them, but I brought 2 back, which wasn't too easy to get those through customs and try to explain what they were. But I got one, so every time I see that concrete shingle, I remember to pray for China. These prayer prompts. How important is it in your ministry to saturate it with prayer? So much so that Jesus spent all night long praying. And then he picks his 8 more disciples, and then he's ready to teach them. And he starts out saying, blessed, blessed, blessed. And that word starts every one of those Beatitudes. Sometimes we're blessed for what we have. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with having things unless you worship those things. But we have, and we're blessed because of things we have. And you've heard people say, he who dies with the most toys wins. Things like that. You know, we have possessions. And sometimes we're blessed by what we do. In fact, you ask most American men who they are, and they'll tell you what they do. Because we're proud of what we do. And it's kind of a man thing, I guess, a macho kind of thing to say, well, this is what I do, instead of who I am. And Jesus looks at those 2 and says, no, we're not talking about either one of those. And Jesus didn't condemn things, again, unless you were worshiping those. He didn't condemn titles, but he says, here's the more important thing, it's who you are. That's where the blessing comes. So, he says, let me tell you who you are. Now, I preached a series of sermons on these Beatitudes. We could talk the rest of the night just on the Beatitudes, but I want to get beyond this to some other things. So I'm going to move through them pretty fast. You've heard them. You've heard sermons and Bible studies, and you've read books about the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of God. A complete reevaluation of wealth. It reminds us that we're not rich in spirit. We're poor in spirit. That means it's all about him, not all about us. In fact, if you have false pride in your accomplishments, everything gets out of sync. It's about him. You remember the children's story of the ant and the elephant? They come to this swinging bridge, and they walk across the bridge, and it swings, and it creaks, and it cracks, and it gives every indication it's not going to last. And they finally get across, and the ant looks up at the elephant and said, "We sure shook that thing, didn't we?" That's false accomplishment. The ant didn't have anything to do with it, but he was proud that he was a part of it. And your accomplishments can get in the way of being poor in spirit. Now, every one of these has a promise to it. Blessed are you when you are poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of God. There's the response. There's the payoff. You get to be a part of the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. There are 9 words in the New Testament for mourning. This is the strongest one. This is the same one that was used when Mary Magdalene went to inform the disciples that Jesus was no longer in the tomb. And she found them doing what? Grieving, mourning, weeping, same word. It's a strong word. I'll give you an illustration. There's the poor in spirit one. Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. The Apostle Paul learned that the closer he got to God, the more he became like Christ, the less he identified himself as being important. So look at the things that he wrote in the order in which he wrote them. You've got AD 48. Paul writes Galatians, and he identifies himself as an apostle. Can you get it on your video replay? He's kind of patting himself on the back. I'm an apostle. From now on, you call me Apostle Paul. But a few years go by, AD 55, he writes 1 Corinthians, and he says about himself, I am the least of the least. Oh, what happened to apostle? Now he's the least of the least. A few more years go by, he gets even more Christ-like. He learns more about the Lord. He serves the Lord in greater ways. And AD 63 comes around, he writes Ephesians, and he says of himself, I am the very least of the least. And toward the end, when he's in prison, and he knows his days are numbered, he writes to young Timothy, and he talks about sinners, of whom he says, I am the chief. Well, he went a long ways from that first description of himself. The closer he got to God, the more he became Christ-like, the more he described himself as not being all that he wanted people to know about him at the very beginning. Blessed are the meek. They will inherit the earth. That word has changed meanings. Meek does not mean weak. There are only 2 men in the Bible that were described as being meek, Jesus and Moses, and neither one of them were weak. So the word doesn't mean what we would have it today. If you describe me or I described you as being meek, you would think, well, that's kind of weak. No, that's not the word. The meek shall inherit the earth. I know a little bit about inheriting. I had a favorite aunt who had no children of her own, so her nieces and nephews kind of became her kids. And in her will, she had put all of her nieces and nephews. And she was a career school teacher, had some money built up. It wouldn't have been a lot of money, but at least it was something that she had left in her will. She died before her husband did. And before he died, he developed early phase of dementia. And among other things, he changed the will and took me out and several others. Got out of the will. And so strange, because when he took us out, he replaced us with his paper boy and the boy that mowed his yard. And it was emotionally painful, not just to know that what my aunt wanted did not happen. It was financially painful because I don't know how much it would have been, but we didn't get it. I didn't get it. But you know what? This inheritance that I've got, that Jesus talked about, inheriting the earth, nobody's going to cancel that one. It's a guaranteed. And I'm not sure what all it entails. I have some ideas, but it's going to be a surprise. Whatever you think heaven is, it's going to be better than that. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be filled. It's an analogy. It's comparing physical hunger and thirst with spiritual hunger and thirst. But there's a difference, because with the physical, when you're hungry and you eat, you reach a point where you say, that's it, I'm full. But when you're talking about the spiritual and you eat, you want more. And the reason you want more is it's righteousness. And so the more you eat of spiritual food, the more you share spiritual food. And the more you share, the hungrier you get. So it's a different kind of hunger and thirst after righteousness. Blessed are the merciful, they shall obtain mercy. Mercy filled. Again, if you're full of mercy, you want to pass some of it on to somebody else. Blessed are the pure in heart, they shall see God. Pure in heart meaning clean, unmixed, unadulterated, unalloyed. Because what you see determines what you think. And what's inside determines what you see on the outside. That's why let me think of a good illustration here. Anybody into astrology? Anybody like to look at the stars and you know what all's up there and that kind of stuff? Well, that didn't work. How about botany? Anybody into flowers? And I mean, you could walk through a garden and tell you what all the flowers are. Yeah. Well, either way, if I walked with you along that, you would say to me, "Well, that's the whatever up here on over here, and these stars are over here, or this is a certain kind of flower, and it's so many letters in it I couldn't pronounce it." And what am I seeing? Stars and flowers. Yeah. That's it. Because I don't know what I'm looking for. Jesus said to his disciples, if you're pure in heart, you get to see God. That's pretty motivating. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. I'm getting way ahead of here. Merciful, pure in heart. Peacemakers, sons of God. Some of the modern translations want to translate that because, after all, you have to be fair to both sexes. And so they'll say, sons and daughters of God. Bad translation. Not because daughters are not children of God, but because in the day in which Jesus said that, the sons were the ones that were important. And the firstborn son is the one who inherited everything and became responsible for everything. And the custom was the men would be 30, 35 years old before they married, and they would marry teenage girls. That was the custom. In fact, you start reading about Joseph and Mary, and you find out that Mary was probably 13, 14, 15 years old, something like that. Joseph was much older. So, peacemakers, sons of God, not to diminish the role of daughters of God, but to say sons of God in the sense of you're inheriting the very character of God because of that sonship that was a part of their culture. Peacemakers, be sure you get the right kind of peace. You are a peacemaker, P-E-A-C-E. You bring people together. You help create peace in the church. Not peacemakers, P-I-E-C-E. Okay. Peacemakers. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then the big one. Those who are persecuted for righteousness, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus makes it personal. He's talking about those, and now he says, you rejoice, be exceedingly glad, great is your reward in heaven. So persecuted they the prophets who were before you. That's not a bad list to be on. Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah, Amos, Robert. Caught him looking the other way. Just, add your own name. Because he says, they persecuted the prophets, and you're going to get persecuted too. And ours comes in all kinds of forms of abuse and bullying and whatever else the popular words are these days. There's a warning. These attributes only possible for the disciples. Other people can't live them because they didn't inherit them. And the encouragement is these men were disciples before they knew about these attributes. So once they began to follow Jesus, he says to them, now let's get this straight. Let me tell you who you are. And he explains this in what we call Beatitudes. So how are we going to get all this done? Now we know who we are. We got a lot to do. How are we going to manage our time and get it done? Say 4 things to you about time management, and then some myths of time management. Number 1, God created time, so don't blame anybody else on it. Genesis 1:14, God said, lights in the heavens, divide the day and the night, signs and seasons, and days and years. He creates time. And then Jesus comes in the fullness of time. Galatians 4, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem, that's the key word, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. So that word redeem is important because it's coming up again in the next one. Why did God send his Son to earth? To redeem the world. What does that mean? Anybody remember S&H green stamps? Only a few of you look old enough to remember those. But we had just gotten married when that was really big. It was popular stuff. And everybody collected green stamps. The grocery stores would have double stamp day on Wednesday. So you go hungry on Tuesday, but you wouldn't buy groceries on Tuesday. Because if you go get groceries on Wednesday, you get double stamps. Gas stations, double, triple stamp day sometime on Thursday. You run out of gas on Wednesday, but you wouldn't get gas on Wednesday. You wait till Thursday to buy your gas because you get double, triple stamps. And they had these books. And you get to put the stamps in the book. And they never stuck. I don't know if you ever remember, you guys always had the job of sticking the stamps in the book. And it tastes terrible. You put them in the book and they don't stick, so you got to put a rubber band around the book. And you get several books and you put it in a brown paper sack so nobody would know you had them. Put them in a drawer, safe in the kitchen. Save them. They're valuable. When we first got married, we were living in Brownwood. There was a radio station in Brownwood that had Want Ads of the Air. Great program. And they'd come on and say, Miss So-and-so has 3 books of S&H green stamps. She'd like to trade somebody for Texas Gold stamps or Buccaneer stamps or whatever other kind of. I mean, people, they hoarded these things up. They're valuable because you had a catalog that said, in this catalog, if you had 5.5 books, you could get a lamp. You probably didn't need a lamp, but after all, you got 5.5 books of stamps that you've been saving. So you're going to trade them in. Get them out that drawer, take that brown paper bag, drive across town to a place that has a sign on the door, Redemption Center. For those of you that thought I got lost in my illustration, we're back. Redemption Center. And you go in there to the desk and you say, I have 5.5 books. And the catalog says, I can get this lamp. And they say, you're right, here's your lamp. They take your books. What just happened? You redeemed your stamps. What does that mean? You traded in something of great value, and you had to live in those days to understand how valuable those stamps were. But you traded in something of value, but you got back something that you perceived to be of greater value, a lamp. So what did God the Father do? He sends His only begotten Son to the world to trade Him in on the world, to redeem the world to Himself. Third thing about time is that one of these days God's going to call time. Book of Revelation states it. The angel I saw standing on the sea and the land raised up his hand in heaven, swore by Him who lives forever and ever, and created heaven and earth, the things that are in it, sea and the things that are in it, that there should be time no longer. One of these days, God's going to call time. It won't be a convenient time. Have you ever been to a convenient funeral? No, nobody dies conveniently. I mean, you don't ever get up in the morning and say, I think I'll check the obituaries and see who died. I don't have anything else to do today. I'd like to go to a funeral. Nah. And when God calls time, it's never a good time on our calendars, but He calls time. I don't know about anybody's old enough for this one. Do you remember a guy named Jim Croce that wrote a song called Time in a Bottle? Jim Croce was a young songwriter with a young family, and he wanted to have more time with his family, and yet he was gaining popularity, and he's on the road, and he's big name. So he wrote this song called Time in a Bottle, where he envisioned putting time in a bottle and putting a cork in the bottle. And when he needed time to be with his family, he just uncorked the bottle and take out some time for his family. It was an interesting idea. Less than a year from when Jim Croce wrote that song, he was killed in a plane crash. If he had been able to put time in a bottle, that bottle would have been smashed to pieces in that plane crash. You can't put time in a bottle. Fourth idea, God in the meantime is going to redeem the time, and He wants us to redeem the time. There's that word back again. What's our job? To redeem the time, to trade in our time for a better time, to give up what we've got to get something that's better than what we've got. So God says, I want you to redeem the time. Ephesians 5:15, Colossians 4:5. So now we have some myths. Some myths of time management. I just need more time. Wrong. You don't need more time. God gave you the same 24 hours a day He gave me. Everybody in here has got the same amount of time. And if you had more time, you wouldn't do any better with it. So you got 24 hours. It's not a matter of needing more time, it's a matter of disciplining yourself to use the time that God has given you. There's another myth. If I work longer, I'll accomplish more. Wrong. Truth is, we lose time in small increments. We don't lose hours, we lose minutes. And if I work longer, I can get more done. No, not really. Well, if I work harder, I'll accomplish more. No, wrong again. Well, I'll manage my time. No, you don't manage your time, you only manage yourself. So these are myths. They lead us to believe that we can do a better job if we had more time, if we worked harder with the time we've got, if we, managed our time better. Not going to happen. So God gives us time, and He says, here's what I want you to do with your time. I want you to redeem the time. Make good use of the time you have. Okay? So what if we have conflicts in ministry? Anybody have those? Surely not. A conflict. What do we do when we have conflicts in ministry? I would like to give you a book, but I don't have any. I wrote this book, Coping with Conflict, a Measure of Discipleship, and the publishing company went out of business. Disappeared from the face of the earth. Could not be found. We couldn't even file a lawsuit. We didn't know where they went. But they owned this copyright to this book. So I couldn't reproduce it. I couldn't publish it somewhere else. I don't know how many copies were written, were published, but not many. But here's what I can do for you. If you will go to my website, which is discipleallnations.org. Excuse me, I'm going to move away from the microphone again. Right up here in the top right corner of that page, when you get to discipleallnations.org, right there it says free ebooks. And there are, 5, 6 books that I've written that are out of print. And this is one of them. And you can read the whole thing. Don't click print. You wipe out a whole ream of paper just printing off that book. Just read it online. It's all right there. What does it say? Well, it develops the idea that's in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. The truth is, we are earthen vessels. I hate to tell you, we are a room full of clay pots, looking something like that. Again, in the culture in which Jesus said that, clay pots were valuable. You couldn't put your belongings in the First National Bank. They didn't have that. So people kept their valuables in clay pots. Money, jewelry, things of real value, they put in clay pots. And so the value of a clay pot was not in the pot, but what was in the pot. And Paul says we're like clay pots. We're like earthen vessels. It's not us that's important. It's what's in us that's important. So, where do the conflicts come from? Well, we got to cope with some God-allowed conflicts. You see, God allows some things to be conflicting in our lives. Have you heard people say, maybe you've said it yourself, God's never going to give you more than you can bear? That is wrong. God is often going to give you more than you can bear to teach you how to trust Him. So there are God-given conflicts, God-allowed conflicts. And we don't need to start identifying any of them. You know what they are. You've probably had some of them. If you haven't, fasten your seatbelt. One's coming. God-allowed conflicts. The Bible's full of them. And then there are self-generated conflicts. Remember the old television program? It started out something like this: your assignment, should you accept it. It was a crime show. And they always gave some impossible looking like chore that you knew was going to be completed within 28 minutes because they had to go to the next show. So you could watch it knowing we're going to get this done. But your assignment, if you choose to accept it. What if your call to ministry had come like this? God said to you, your assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to change the world. Your assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to stamp out sin. And your response is, I can't do that. And there's the problem. We tend to take on God's assignments as though it's all up to us. It's not. We're in this together. None of it is up to me. It's up to we. And I'll say some more about that in just a minute. Human-created conflict. Sometimes we create our own problems. And sometimes we who lead churches get caught in problems that people create. So that night, there were two deacons sitting on the front row. One was on that end and one was on that end, and they both were holding copies of Robert's Rules of Order. And it was a business meeting. I was the interim pastor, and they said, because you're the interim pastor, the bylaws say you have to moderate the meeting. They had fired their pastor and then gave him 6 months' pay because they loved him. How strange we are. And the 6 months were up. And they had decided early on when they fired him that if he got another ministry position, they wouldn't have to pay him anymore. But he hadn't. So now we're up through 6 months. He doesn't have a job. And they're debating whether they still love him enough to give him some more money or whether they just want to go ahead and fire him. And I'm moderating the meeting. This is a classic case of human-created conflict. They created their own problem. I wasn't a member of the church, so I wasn't around when they fired him. I don't know what all the reasons were. I just heard the rumors. But I suspect they might have solved that problem early on if they had attacked it early on, instead of having me moderate the meeting 6 months into it and trying to decide what they're going to do with him. So 2.5 hour business meeting. What I succeeded in doing was making everybody mad. So at least they left united. That's about all I could do for them. Nobody was happy. There's no happy ending to that story that you can even imagine. But we had to deal with it because it was a human-created conflict. And you have those in church life. In fact, isn't it in the Bible where 2 or 3 are gathered together, somebody causes a problem? Isn't that somewhere in the Bible, I think? It's the book of Second Opinions, probably. And then there is Satan-caused conflict. So finally you get to blame it on Satan. And he does create conflict. Conflict that we can't even understand. We are somewhat limited by our culture. I took a group of seminary students to West Africa, to Benin. Benin is the devil-worshipping capital of the world. And I don't know what all we got into, things I never intended, but we were visiting with a pastor and a woman walked in and she was demon-possessed. And my goodness, we spent a couple of hours praying over her and talking to her, and eventually she comes out praising God, and the demons apparently left. And we all walk out, and the students look at me and say, okay, Dr. Crawford, talk. I don't know what to say. You know, Satan created problems. I knew that much. I didn't know what all had happened and how we get out of that and how we got ourselves into it to start with. There's things we don't really understand, everything we need to understand about. But that's the way Satan is. He goes on the attack. And he attacks us where we're vulnerable. And he attacks us where we're strong because he figures if he can attack our strengths, then he's got the rest of us. So we really ought to talk about spiritual warfare, but I'm going to do something different. You know about Ephesians 6, the armor of God. So now I'm going to give you a book. Ambassadors on Mission. The priority of prayer and proclamation. And with this one, the publisher did go bankrupt, but not until they published some books. But when they went bankrupt, they just sent me what they had in the storeroom. And I got a bunch of these things that I don't need. And I don't think I can sell them, so I'm just going to give them to you. Unfortunately, I did this same teaching this morning, and those guys took most of the books. So I don't have enough for everybody to take one. I think I've got about 15 or so books left, and somewhere, oh, they're back here. We'll get them to the back, and you can pick them up as you go out. Leave quick. You hang around, you may lose. I'll bring some more next month. But the book is about the 6th chapter of Ephesians. So, what does that say? Paul says, be strong in the Lord in the strength of his might. Can you imagine putting those 3 words in one sentence? Be strong in the strength of his might. That's pretty powerful. And then he talks about the armor of God. And you guys that preach have preached on that. You got powerful sermons on these things. The armor of God. I got 2 things to say about the armor of God, and that's all, because I'm going to give you the book. Number 1, I had a pastor who kept saying, you need to wake up every morning and pray on the armor of God. And I always wanted to stand up and yell, why'd you take it off? You know, just a curious question. I didn't do it. The Roman soldiers slept in their armor. You read Roman history. And especially when the enemy was near, they not only slept in their armor, they slept with that sword right there. So why would we want to take ours off in order to pray it on the next morning? Now, I know it's an analogy, and we're not really putting on pieces of armor, but even given that, why not just acknowledge every morning that God has equipped you, given you sword of the Spirit and so forth, instead of having to start all over every morning? If you don't understand what I'm saying, just let me say to you, if you pray on the armor of God because you took it off the night before, Satan is going to wear you out before breakfast while you're sleeping without your armor on. Stay with it. Satan's looking for vulnerable spots to hit us. So the warfare, we're positioned for it. Stand strong. Goes through all the pieces of the armor. You know what's not there? Oh, come on, you guys have preached on this. What piece of armor is missing? What part of the body is not protected? The back. Why? You don't retreat. We're moving up. We're moving on. As somebody said this morning, God's got your back. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. No piece of armor for the back. You don't need it. If you need armor for your back, you're in the wrong business anyway. So he keeps mentioning. He talks about advancing. What's the purpose of all this armor anyway? A lot of people teach and preach on this and forget the last couple of verses where it says, here's what it's all for. You move forward in prayer and proclamation. That's why you have the armor. Because when you start seriously praying and seriously proclaiming the truth, guess who's coming after you? So, I have something to read for you. It's called a mandate to Satan. Satan, take note. Listen well. Get off my back. You'll not conquer me. I'm blood-washed, spirit-filled, daily delivered, strongly sanctified, spirit-soaked, word indwelt. I am linked with sovereign and eternal power and have set my face. You're a deceiver, but you won't deceive me. You're a liar, but you won't lie to me. You're a killer, but you won't murder me. You're a roaring lion, but I'm not devourable. You're extremely subtle, but I'm on to your ways. You parade as an angel of light, but I walk in a brighter light. Your days of deception are over with me. I won't be deceived, detoured, derailed, distorted, distanced, discouraged, or disillusioned by your schemes. Your vile influence won't cross the no trespassing sign on the door of my heart. My life is off limits to you now. My doors are all closed to you forever. You won't walk in, crawl in, slither in, sneak in, pry in, jump in, swim in, fly in, drive in, or barge into my life. I have a permanent guest that now lives inside of me, and he cannot share my temple with you. You may lure, lie, linger, lurch, laugh, lunge, or leap, but you won't come in. Your days are numbered. Your kingdom is doomed. Your designs are dwindling. Your evil is eroding. Your devilishness is dissolving. Your deceit is decaying. Your deception is diminishing. And your death is dying. Your progress is poisoned. Your poison is paralyzed. Your penetration is profitless. Your ultimate victory has been canceled. And soon your show will be over. You can't trap me with your wares, soil me with your subtlety, or defeat me with your deception. He that is in me is greater than he that is in you. Now get off my property. Amen. For the day of your final binding is not far away. Are you handing those out already? Yes, that's what you got a copy of it. So, no, that's not me. This guy wrote it. Bob Moorhead, and there's the book if you want to document it. Somebody's going to use that next Sunday. Let me tell you how you do that, or anything else I've said. When you use something, you say, Dr. Crawford said. The second time you use it, you say, it has been said. The third time you use it, you say, I've always thought. Then it's yours. So we are ministers of the church. We're talking about ministers' ministry. And where does your ministry take place? In and through the church. So the big question comes from time to time, what's the future of my church? Let me try to answer that for you. It's in Matthew 16, 13 through 18. The scene was Caesarea Philippi. It's where Jesus took his disciples to teach them the lesson. It was an area that was littered with temples of Syrian gods. history of religious pilgrimage of Israel was all around. The big white marble home to Caesar worship dominated the landscape. And here in Caesarea Philippi, this homeless carpenter took 12 ordinary men and asked them 2 questions. And by the way, Caesarea Philippi was built on top of another city. And the other city was called Panias. Pan meaning all, Pan-American, all. Deus, God. So that ancient city was a city of all gods. And as it was destroyed, Caesarea Philippi was built on top of it. So Jesus takes his disciples there and he says, in a place like this, "Who do men say that I am?" And they say, "Well, some people say you're Jeremiah, Ezekiel, one of the prophets." Wrong answer. Human answers for who Jesus is never have been enough. So he says, nice try, guys. Who do you say I am? And as with every other question he asked his disciples, Peter answered. That would get so old in a group of 12. But Peter just always answered. That's who he was. He just, whether he was right or wrong, he always had an answer. And Peter was right this time. He says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds to him, "And you are Petros, little pebble, small rock, a piece of the rock, a chip off the rock. And upon this Petra, large boulder, I'm going to build my church." If you don't already know that description, maybe that will help you as you deal with the people around you. Peter didn't get anything that day. He was not acknowledged to be anything special other than, on your kind of faith, Peter, a chip off the rock, I'm going to build my church. But I'm going to build my church on the rock. My is in the emphatic position. It's the subject. My church. I'm going to build Peter's church. I'm going to build God's church. He's going to build it on the rock. I've been to this place a couple of times, or at least one like it, because these kind of scenes are all around Caesarea Philippi. And if this was the place where I was, that water that looks like it's coming over a dam kind of trickles down into a little stream. And I can picture Jesus and the disciples down there as we were. And in that little stream, there are these little pebbles that have come off of the big stone monument, the stone wall. And I can picture him leaning down, picking one up and saying, "Peter, this is who you are. You're just a chip off a rock. And on this rock, this boulder, I'm going to build my church." So I was invited to speak at a conference at Shaco Springs Baptist Camp in Alabama. And don't do this, guys. Don't invite somebody to preach in your church or lead a conference in your church, and when they say yes, then tell them what it's about. That's not fair. But people do it, and this group did it to me. And so I'd already agreed I would be at their conference and I would speak on Sunday morning. And then they sent me the idea. They said the text for the entire conference is this text in Matthew 16. And the title of your sermon is, "If it is to be, it's up to me." So that's not right. You can read that passage as many times as you want to read it. That's not what that says. I can't preach that sermon. So it was a little late to reprint the program, so I just went on to the camp, got up Sunday morning, do my thing, and I said, there's a mistake in the program. It's listed my third point as the subject. So just hang on, I'll get there in a minute. But with apologies to you English teachers, if it is to be, it's up to he. I will build my church. Don't ever forget who you're working for and who you're working with. It's his business, his church. I got, no, that's not fair. Bad news and good news. Bad news is God doesn't need you. He doesn't need me. The good news is he's chosen us. He wants us to help him grow his church. But he's not going to build it on us. Now, the second thing in this passage, after it says, I will build my church, is that if it is to be, it's up to we. Us. The koinonia that becomes the ecclesia. Sorry, that's all the Greek I know. You just got it right there in one sentence. The koinonia, the fellowship of believers that becomes the ecclesia, the church. It's up to us, together. That's how you build a church and grow a church. I will build my church. Church being people, groups. It's going to build it on a solid foundation. It's up to us. When we lived in the Rio Grande Valley 250 years ago, no, 55 years ago, the McAllen, is it the Monitor? McAllen Monitor. Front page story. I wish I'd have kept this. It's talking about a group of pipe layers near Harlingen, and they had dug this trench and laid these heavy pipes in the trench, and it got to be 5 o'clock, so they went home. When they came back the next morning, the pipes were gone. And they initially thought somebody had stolen the pipes. They said, well, why would anybody want these big old heavy pipes? But the pipes were so heavy, they were heavier than the soil. And they sunk and disappeared. That's because this is not skyscraper territory. I was thinking about that article and looking around, and there were some second story and third story buildings, but there weren't any New York City skyscrapers in the Rio Grande Valley. Probably still aren't. Because of the soil. Now, nothing wrong with the soil. You can do great things with the Rio Grande Valley soil, but you can't build a skyscraper on it. Jesus said, I want to build my church. Have you ever heard anybody say, well, Pastor, I just want to be a part of a New Testament church? Here's your response. Which one do you want to be a part of? Corinth? Well, they were ensnarled in immorality and jealousy, according to the Bible. Well, how about Galatia? Well, they were having a doctrinal tailspin. Well, you want to be a part of Ephesus? They'd already gone back to pre-Christian practices. How about Pergamum? No, they tolerated false teachings of Balaam. Well, Thyatira, how about being a part of that New Testament church? No, they tolerated immorality. Sardis, inner spiritual decay. What about the church at Philadelphia? Demonstrated little power. Well, would you like to be a part of the New Testament church at Laodicea? No, lukewarm. Which New Testament church do you want to be a part of? They all had problems. As does yours, probably. So all the more reason why Romans 12:5 is a good verse. We are members of one another. If it is to be, it's up to we. Not sure about some organizations, but this much I'm pretty sure of. When Jesus returns, the bride will be waiting. It may not be your version of it, may not be my version of it, but the bride, the church that he created, will be waiting. So I finally got to point 3, which made the leaders of the conference very happy. If it is to be, it's up to me. Because he did mention Peter. So there is a sense in which the individuals have a lot to do with what happens with the church. It is his church, and it is built on a solid rock, and it is about we, the congregation, but it's also about individuals. So if it is to be, it's up to me. And interesting that it would be Peter that he singles out, because this is the guy that thought he could walk on water. Now, don't be too critical of Peter. He took one more step on water than you've taken. He did get one step in before he sunk. But this is who Jesus is talking to. This is the one to whom Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." It's the one to whom Jesus said, "Do you love me?" And he said, "I like you." I just figure if God could use Simon Peter, surely he can use me. I read the story of the little girl that got the job of serving chicken at the picnic, political picnic. The governor was there. He'd been campaigning all day, and they told this little girl, "Now we don't have enough chicken for everybody, so everybody gets one piece of chicken." So eventually the governor comes through the line and she puts a piece of chicken on there. He says, "Young lady, I've been working hard all day. I've been campaigning, and could I have 2 pieces of chicken?" She said, "No." He said, maybe you don't know who I am. I'm the governor of this state." She said, "Maybe you don't know who I am. I'm the one in charge of handing out chicken." So in that sense, it was up to her. So I don't care if you're the pastor, if you're the associate pastor, if you're the chief deacon, if you're the person that greets folks at the door, if you're the one that counts the money while everybody else is in the service worshiping. It doesn't matter who you are. If it is to be, it's to some sense up to you, because we're all in this together, the church. So if anything significant happens on the rock where you serve, it's going to be up to he, we, and you, and me. So the minister's conclusion comes out of Ecclesiastes. I knew you'd get tired of me quoting out of the New Testament, so look around in Ecclesiastes, it makes you look smart, Ooh, he read Ecclesiastes. Well, it's not very good reading, to tell you the truth. I mean, you want to be depressed tonight, just go home and read Ecclesiastes. But when Solomon gets to the end of the book, the conclusion, that's where it gets good. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, he says, next to the last verse. Fear God, keep his commandments. So tonight's conclusion is an encouraging word. And we need that. We no longer live where seldom is heard a discouraging word. A lot of discouraging words today. We've been through a lot of discouragement. I mean, we endured the COVID pandemic. I'm talking about as a church, as church is. I don't think I can name 6 churches that are back where they were before COVID, number-wise. I mean, it did us in. We thought we were doing good because we got an iPad and said to our folks at home, if you can't come or you're worried about coming, you can stay home in your pajamas on your couch, watch us on the iPad, drink your coffee. And they stayed home. And you know where they are? They're still at home. I mean, we taught them how to do that. And so they liked it. So they're still at home in their pajamas on Sunday morning, sitting in their reclining chair, drinking coffee, and watching their iPad. That's not all bad. But again, a lot of churches I know are discouraged. I'm interim pastor of one. I've been there over a year now. They told me last week they had 117 resumes. They didn't like any of them. Can you imagine? 117 guys and you can't pick one of them? They can't agree on any of them. They're so discouraged. This is a church that before COVID would have 250, 300 people on Sunday morning. Now it's about 125 maybe. And I don't know that they're going to get back to where they were. So we've been through some discouragement. The economy has been bad in places. A lot of pastors I know are tired, ready to quit. It's just a discouraging time. Well, that's where Solomon was. And Solomon was thought to be the smartest man alive in his day. But you start reading Ecclesiastes and he's describing the circumstances around him before he gets to this conclusion. And I don't want to read all of them because I'd really get you so discouraged you wouldn't want to go home tonight. But chapter 1, he says, "What profit has man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? I've attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me. In much wisdom is much grief. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." Isn't that encouraging? Chapter 2, "I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done was distressing to me." Chapter 3, "What happens to the sons of men? All go to one place. All are from the dust, and they're going to return to the dust." Chapter 4, "The tears of the oppressed, they have no comforter." Chapter 6, "Who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his life are vain, and they pass like a shadow." I hadn't heard any amens in a while. Chapter 9, "The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. But time and chance happen to all of them. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time." Whew. That's tough. I'll send my resume to that church. Chapter 11, "If a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many." And chapter 12, the better known verse of there, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, absolute futility, everything is futile." Or the NIV says, "Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless." And then Solomon concludes. He says, "But fear God, keep his commandments." Or as the Message paraphrases, "Fear God and do what he says." I thought I'd show you a perfect church. Don't send your resume. You'll mess it up. I can't go there. It's, they may not even have any members. I don't know. That church actually is in Atlanta, Georgia. I saw it and I almost ran over the fire plug on the sidewalk turning around to get back and take a picture of it. And now you can type in Google the perfect church and you may get that picture. There are no perfect churches. And the one that Solomon was describing, and I know that churches came in the New Testament, but the group that Solomon was describing, they weren't perfect. They were discouraged, they were imperfect, but he concludes by saying to them, "Fear God, do what he tells you." So what do you say to a discouraged church? And I'm making an assumption that Some of you pastors, maybe all of you, have had moments of discouragement along the way. What do you say? When you're discouraged and the church seems to be discouraged, the conclusion is, and Paul nailed it in 1 Thessalonians 5:11, encourage one another. So, with everything else I've said tonight, we've covered a lot of material. I want to encourage you. Fear God. Do what He says. Next month, March 21st, I guess same place, same time, unless somebody tells me different. But we're going to talk about the minister's difficulties, and you probably don't have any of those, so, no. But if you have any difficulties, bring them with you. We'll tackle them head on. Disciple-shaped book, chapters 8 and chapters 5, if you want to read ahead, get some idea of that. And as always, I give you ways to get in touch with me. Email address, you may not want to try that. I have nearly crashed my email this week. I wrote an article of my observations about the revival meeting that's coming out of Asbury University in Wilmore, Kentucky. The first of those hit Asbury College in 1970. I was the Baptist student minister at a place called Pan American University then. It took a while for it to get here. That revival started on the East Coast in Wilmore, Kentucky, and on the West Coast with a group they called Jesus People, hippies, flower children, and it swept across America. And it took about 2 years for it to get to the Rio Grande Valley. But when it hit here, it hit. And churches started calling me, come and explain to us what's going on. I remember going to a rather large church on a Sunday morning because they said, we hear that some of these long-haired, barefoot people are going to show up here. And we need you to come and preach because you know how to handle them. Well, I didn't, but I didn't tell them that. And I remember as I started to preach, here they came in. And they came down the aisle and they sat on the floor in between the front row and the pulpit. Maybe 10 or 12 of them. And you could hear this corporate, all the people in the church, oh, what are we going to do? And after a few minutes, this elderly man with a cane gets up and starts down the aisle, and it takes him a while to get to the front. And when he gets down where they are, he just plops down on the floor right in the middle of them. And everybody relaxed. But I was also in chapel at Southwestern Baptist Seminary in 1995 when the revival that swept across the country in the mid-90s hit. Chapel started at 10 o'clock. It was still going at 5 o'clock. Students giving testimonies, confessing sin, praising God, singing, reading scripture. Most interesting thing about that was at 5 o'clock the security people came in and said, we have to lock the building. It's Wednesday. You have to go to prayer meeting. Can you imagine shutting down a revival meeting to go to prayer meeting? But the interesting thing was that when students and staff and faculty spread out to churches around Fort Worth on Wednesday night and shared what happened, same things happened. So I had written some observations several years ago from my students. And I pulled those out and posted them on Facebook as to what was happening right now at Asbury University and Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. And I posted it, and in 48 hours I had over 1,000 responses. I don't know what it takes to crash Facebook, but I guess I was probably on the verge of it. I picked up about 50 or so new Facebook friends. I don't know why they want to be my friend, but they did. And most of them are pastors, so I figure they're safe. It may be dangerous. It's a church. Not everybody that shows up looks like us. And it never has been that way. And it may not have been that way when you showed up. But God says, I'm going to build it. And it's going to be here when I come back. So, fear God. That doesn't mean be afraid. It means respect God. and do what he says.
This is episode number 3 of Discipleship.